My name is Nathaniel Dworsky. I'm a filmmaker. I make a living as a film editor, mostly working with documentaries which are on educational television. But my real love and the real center of my being is making my own films, which are more in the spirit of being a poet than a journalist. My films are silent, and very often I'm asked why my films are silent. And first of all, I come from a tradition of the American avant-garde where silence in cinema is not a particularly exotic thing. So and on one level, I'm part of a lineage. I've experienced things within the avant-garde that were silent presentations, which I found had tremendous depth. As a film editor in the industry and the world, I always work with sound, and I'm very sensitive to it and enjoy it. But there's something about making a silent film which allows people to have the experience of being alone with themselves in front of a screen. If I brought in sound, you would be in the room watching the screen, but it would be a more socialized experience. And it seems very interesting to allow people to have an experience of being alone with themselves the same way as if they were alone with themselves in their room or sitting out on a rock somewhere in the country, to actually bring forth that very precious state of mind which we have when we're not trying to meet any kind of social convention, and the pure nakedness of who we are can blossom. So I think making a silent film and articulating with the silence, it's not just making a film that doesn't have sound. Once there isn't sound, then you actually have to be able to articulate, make the images articulate the silence, almost dance with the silence, put up tensions within the silence. Then you can start to communicate to people on a nonverbal level and on a very intimate level. I very much want to make films which in themselves are Buddhist prayers. They are prayers. I wouldn't even say Buddhist prayers because that's very confusing for people. It could limit, in the context of a Buddhist film festival, in the context of your show, it would make sense to say that. But I would never say that publicly. It would only cause more confusion than clarity. Film, in a way, as it's normally used, is used to gratify the needs of our daytime mind. The daytime mind is the mind which figures out how to get through the day, survive, pay the rent, eat, shelter, and so forth. That's normally how film is used, that part of the mind. And I became very interested into seeing what it would be like if film itself had a chance to be what it itself is, rather than using it for our own particular needs. So I began to work with film in a certain way and take images based on a kind of intuitive interest in things, not on a preconception of what a film might be. I began to trust the fact that if I became interested in something and interested in a particular attitude of the camera toward that thing, that therefore, if I collected a number of things over a period of time, that there would be some kind of cohesion there only because it was me who was interested in them. It's not that different than perhaps the way we use various details of our daily life for dream imagery. We never know what little detail from our daily experience will be then used later on for dream language. So in that sense, I let myself become interested in whatever I'm interested in for maybe a period of 5 or 6 months, 9 months, a year. And then I trust that there's a matrix there, that there's some kind of filmic resonance which has to do with my unconscious and which has to do with a deeper sense of presence than what film normally has to deal with, which is, let's say, one's conceptual sense of presence, what one thinks one is, what one thinks the world is. Because underneath our daily activity, for instance, shooting this interview, is our whole emotional landscape, which has a whole depth and reality, which film rarely touches on. So I shoot these images, and then I began to work with them, and I began to find relationships between them which generally are surprising to me. In other words, if I can conceive of a relationship between two of the images, usually it's corny on some level. It has to do with filmmaking and what we've always conceived of as film. But when I move the images around, suddenly relationships are indicated to me which are genuinely surprising. But not only genuinely surprising visually, they're genuinely surprising in that they begin to evoke a sense of our own being, a sense of our spirit, a sense of nowness, in a sense they're nurturing. So relationships begin to develop by moving the film itself around, which becomes a kind of nurturing language. This is not a language based on something that I could conceive particularly. So in a certain sense, I'm more like a sheepdog moving sheep around as an editor than I am someone making images conform to a conceptual idea. In other words, a sheepdog will knows he has to move the sheep from one area to another, that the film has to begin, have a middle and end, have a shape. But as far as the actual movement of all the sheep, there's a lot of chaos. So what I try to do in my own work is to have some kind of union of the mind's ability to see clearly and what chaos can offer, what randomness can offer. In other words, I feel I'm limited in a way. If I were to try to make the entire film out of my conceptual mind, it would be rather limited and not much different than most films we see. But by allowing circumstance and the quality of mystery and isness to actually participate, I can begin to make a film much larger than myself and deeper than that I could normally communicate. The primary obligation of a Buddhist film would be not to bring further duality into the world. And so how do you not bring further duality into the world? One is the attitude of the camera. It's very, very delicate. For instance, there are many, many films which are not conscious of the screen itself. They're only conscious of the subject matter within the screen, right? That would be comparable to being a person who had no sense that they were seeing the world, they only saw the world. Right? It would be slightly a false view. There are other filmmakers, for instance, who are maybe sort of more vain and so forth, who you only realize the view is the predominant thing, the sense of composition, the sense of form is so dominant that the subject matter sort of withers within them. I've seen many Buddhist films that have faltered, so-called Buddhist films that have faltered in that direction. Both of them are a distortion and both of them are a kind of dualism, one between the seer and what is seen. So one of the primary things I think a film, what we'd call a Buddhist film, would have to do would be to have a union of opposites, so that in a sense the screen and what is within the screen would have to be simultaneously expressive. Not only that, but the nature of the screen itself would have to have a kind of invitation to the viewer, so that there was no separation between the screen and the viewer. In other words, in a way, a triple trick of magic has to happen. One is between the filmmaker and the objects that they film, then between the camera and the objects, then between the screen and the audience. So if everything is done properly, then the audience can experience the screen with the same open-heartedness that the filmmaker is experiencing the world. But that takes a lot of awareness, of visual awareness. Now in editing, the same kind of success or failure can happen by creating duality. If you make a cut, and the cut is primarily conceptual, in other words, you make a cut to something, and your mind takes over, this cut means something. You lose the moment, you drift into concept. That's the way most film works. Yes, it's successful in the same sense that that delusion is successful. But I think if a film is really a truly Buddhist film, as it moves from one image to the other, it brings forth the present moment. It reawakens the primordial present.
When you talk about what a Buddhist film is, there really would be two different types. So if you take for example something like Bertolucci's Little Buddha, which I think starts with a very interesting, very promising frame story, where you have showing up on the front door of a Seattle suburban family's home, Buddhist monks from Tibet who think that their son may be the reincarnated Lama from Tibet. Now that's a very interesting story. But I think Bertolucci doesn't really have the courage of his vision to continue with that story, but feels that for his audience, apparently his ignorant audience, he has to step back and then tell in almost cartoonish form the life story of the Buddha. And the way this is brought in is that they're trying to educate the young boy about Buddhism, so they use a children's book about Buddhism to tell the Buddha's life story. One movie that I like, for example, is a movie by Peter Weir called Fearless. The movie starts off and actually ends as well with a plane crash. One of the most terrifying sequences I've ever seen in cinema, in fact, where a man is clearly aware that he is about to die. And in the course of the plane going down, he gives up his will to live and kind of gives himself over to his death. The question really is, how do you live in the world if you've given up your sense of self? So you think of the Buddhist principle like that of non-self, which is one of the foundational principles in the Buddhist tradition across Asia. What does it really mean to experience non-self? Well, this is kind of what happens with this man. He has that experience, but he doesn't know how to ground the experience because he hasn't done practice. And so it kind of raises the question of if you have an experience as profound as that of non-self, but without the foundation and practice in order to ground that experience, would you be able to function? The answer, quite obviously, is no. The term that the Linji Chan or the Rinzai Zen people use is called falling into emptiness. You've sort of dropped into emptiness, but you're sort of floundering in midair, unable really to grasp and hold on to anything anymore.
someone at one point of time we call the Buddha, who was a genius, had a perception which was from the point of view of genius. And by genius I mean is that he saw through everything. He wasn't trying to use part of himself to manipulate another part of himself. It wasn't that at all. It's similar to Einstein or something like E equals mc squared. He realized that if you tried to get rid of your suffering and your pain, that you would only cause eventually more pain. I guess this is called the Four Noble Truths. I'd rather think of it in less Oriental language. I think it's more helpful. But if we realize that if we can include that suffering, then there's the possibility to transform that suffering through tenderness and awareness. So I guess in filmmaking you could say the same thing. How can you make a film which in itself, the actual fabric of the film, brings forth to the audience tenderness and awareness, openness of heart, clarity of vision, a certain sense of actual poignancy for what our impermanent lives are, but at the same time, simultaneously, a sense that the whole thing is transparent. We're living in an atmosphere which is so permeated by product acquisition and sales. In other words, the whole religious atmosphere that we live in, at least in America or maybe in the basically the changing world, is one of materialism. Now we often use the word materialism in the pejorative sense, but if you think of it deeply, the entire nature of the economy, the way our communities are organized, the way the workplace is organized, the way the marketplace is organized, the way streets are laid out, everything has to do at this point with marketing. This is what you could call a dark age, the Kali Yuga. It's a very difficult time, a time where you have to have tremendous clarity not to be seduced by the water of the aquarium that we're all swimming in. We're completely permeated. In other words, the way things are, just the way cities are organized, the way everything is organized, it's organized around merchandise. It's organizing around getting people to work, allowing people to buy things, right? So the whole shape of the streets, the city, I mean, everything in our atmosphere is antithetical to shall we say, a cutting through, that delusion. So this is a time of great courage. It takes great courage to participate in something genuine.
It's a big responsibility to be someone who makes media. And so if I were someone who knew that my work would be seen or heard by many, many people and would have an effect on many people, I would say to myself, I better tend to my spiritual practice. I better tend to my own personal truth. And I better make sure that I spend some time on that I'm cultivating my own heart and my own enlightenment and my own mind, and trusting that if I do that, and I'm sincere about my work, something good will come through. I do actually, from time to time, take photographs. And when I take photographs, what I like about it is that it helps me to see. I see the world with a more lively sense if I'm going to photograph it. So I think if I would make a movie, it would be just to show how amazing the visual world is, you know, how amazing water and all of its movements are. I live near the ocean, you know, to see the water and all of its movements, or the sky and its movements, or people moving through space, or buildings with windows reflecting light. I think I would make a film probably with no words in it, just a film bringing forth the visual world. If I ask myself, have I changed at all? I could answer myself truthfully, I haven't changed a bit. I could also ask myself, have I changed at all? And I can say to myself also truthfully, yes, I've changed really a lot. But then if I say, how have I changed and why have I changed? I can't really say it's because of Buddhist practice. Because maybe I changed because I got older, or because the world changed, or because of the books I read, or the people I spoke with, or because I had a family, and so forth and so on. So, but people tell me that the practice matters to them and that it changes their lives. So I do believe that Buddhist practice is revolutionary in a person's life, but you can't look for that, and you can't try to measure it. In a way, in the end, I suppose it's a matter of faith more than it is a matter of objective measuring of how one has changed, or in what way one has changed, or what are the factors that cause one to change. So it's a little complicated, I think. Better to just practice for the sake of practice, knowing that practice is a good thing.
I've studied with a number of Tibetan teachers, and I think that, and at least in the Tibetan teachings, that at least as it's taught in English to Americans, the term heartbreak is often brought up. That a broken heart is the actual, in a way, path or doorway to awakening. Because this situation actually is heartbreaking. You know, here we are in these mortal shells. You know, animals, we're animals, but we're animals who can see through ourselves. In other words, we're no different than animals. We need shelter. We fall in love, you know, we certainly are born, live for a period, and die. We're just like animals, except we have the ability to see through that experience. We can see through it, and at the same time, we're entrapped by it. So the whole situation that we can see through who we are, and yet we are who we are, not to understand that as heartbreaking, right, is to not really come to terms with the depth of our reality. So in a certain sense, heartbreak is the depth of our reality. Not heartbreak in the sense of glomming onto a tragic point of view, or a sense of being a loser, but that the actual situation of our lives is both magical, luminous, present, and it's heartbreaking. It's very wonderful for a film to be able to bring nowness to an audience. Nowness is not really dissimilar from bringing people to themselves. In other words, our true self exists in nowness. It's always there. Our heart is always there. And often we lose sense of that. We get distracted. We start to grasp at things. Once we begin to grasp at things, then there's no end to it. We want this, we want that. Maybe in 5:30 we can do this, we can do that. And there's a continual low level of dissatisfaction, right? Which sometimes we try to gratify with product, as we were talking about, or it could be, sexual desire, or it could be, whatever, drugs, whatever. These things aren't bad in themselves, of course. But behind all of that irritation and uncomfortableness of relative time, there rests nowness. Suddenly, when we return to nowness, we realize that we're in the middle of mystery, in the middle of the universe, that we have everything. Nowness is not something that the commodity culture wants to promote, because it means that you're satisfied. It means not only satisfied, but you're fully in touch and part of your own being. People who maybe shop around with Buddhism or shop around with spirituality are actually looking for some kind of eternal solution within relative existence. And as soon as they come up upon the more shadow side or the more difficult part of any kind of tradition, they may then pull away and say, no, I'm going to look for another product. In a certain way, the world we live in, which is this world of the free market and capital, right? A world which promotes, is the essence of the anti-dharma. It promotes duality, insecurity, desire. In other words, we live in a fish tank. If we were fish, the water that we're swimming in is one which promotes a lack of self-worth, one that suggests that by obtaining something exterior, you would then be complete. This, of course, extends into religion. In fact, Buddhism, the word Zen and so forth, is being used as a commodity on that relative level. It's becoming more and more common. But the truth of it is that the essence of the Buddhist teachings, as I understand them, is that you cannot secure some kind of eternity within the relative world. And it's only by experiencing the heartbreak which makes you give up some kind of relative solution that you come into a deeper sense of nowness and what life actually has to offer.
Wilt u dvd's bestellen van onze programma's? Bel dan 040 282 0022. Wilt u meer weten over onze uitzendingen? Vraag dan nu de gratis programmagids aan. Bel 035 629 3191 of kijk op www.boeddhistischeomroep.nl.